Today we're visiting Caerleon in Wales. It's a Roman legionary museum, and with this we're combining the Roman baths, about 4 minutes walk around the corner, and the amphitheatre. Now, despite the outside looks, it looks like a Second World War bunker stuck on the side of a Georgian building. It's actually a really fascinating museum. It's free of charge. I would definitely recommend visiting this. I'm not going to stop and look at every item, but we're just going to go through a bit of a feel of the museum. There's a very good introduction of the history of Rome in Britain and in Wales, and then some good examples of glassware, pottery, and some metal objects that have been found all within the fort itself. Because this was very much a fort, it was just for Roman legionaries. It wasn't a trading post or a town the way that Caerwent was. But it had all the luxuries, and between the two you have a very good feel for what the Romans could achieve. They didn't do anything by halves. And we'll see that at the Roman baths and also with the amphitheatre. The Romans really engineered things to last. And here in the museum we have some interesting stones with inscriptions. A lot about the currency, about the local area. The city of the Legion is how they're translating Caerleon. And the museum's really just 2 rooms. But there's a very interesting map here of the empire and where some of the finds at Caerleon have come from, along with pictures of legionaries. And anyone with an interest in Rome will love the armours and recreation of the different ranks of legionary. Explanation of the structure of the army, how it was commanded and organised. An original legionnaires' helmet there, spearheads, roof tiles, all artefacts from this fort. And it's quite a decent collection of items, really, from the mundane to the fascinating. And certainly well presented, well explained, well worth a visit. It's a good selection of Roman material. Like, these bowls were from France, and they were obviously bought over by the Romans because they wanted better quality pottery. And then here's local stone that's been carved for decoration of the fort. And here's a burial. It's a burial of ashes, so a lead jar and a sarcophagus. They were here for a couple of 100 years. There had been a hill fort nearby, and Isca Augusta, which is now Caerleon, was built to defend against. They'd been quite a troublesome bunch, the local Silures tribe, and there was 20 years of fighting. So they built a fort to ensure that it was properly provisioned and protected. From the hundreds of years that the Romans were here, they left a lot of artefacts behind, which are beautifully described and displayed in this museum. They have some coins, quite an interesting collection. At the back there's an area for schools that opens out onto the garden, which we'll go to in a minute. And behind that, there's a Roman legionary changing room. So if you're about 10 years old, you can try on, in the barracks rooms here, uniforms, which sadly none fit me. But you get a feel for what their room would have been like. And it's worth noting that room because, although I'm focusing here on the gladius and the dagger and the spear, the bunk beds there, that's what the rooms would look like when we get to the barracks. Now, at the back of the museum is a recreated Roman garden. So, from archaeological record and literature, there's a reconstruction where you can see plants that they would have grown. I'm sure this looks lovely in the summer, but also the way they laid it out in beds. You can see the structure and layout of a typical garden along with seating. I'd say ignore the wooden bench on my left, but the stone one on the right rather, whereas the stone one on my left is much more accurate. And ignore the car hidden in the trees there. But gives you a good idea of what a Roman garden would have looked like. Probably the governor's garden would have looked something like this. And at the back there's a seating area where you can sit outside and enjoy a pleasant, warm Welsh night, play some music and drink some wine and pretend you're back home in Rome. It's a nice idea, this garden, and certainly a very good museum I'd recommend, and completely free of charge. The Baths is a separate museum run by Cadw, which is, there is a small charge for it, but you can get in for free if you're an English Heritage member. So here's the roofed area at the back where they could sit and enjoy and eat for really outdoor dining. Now, just down the road from there is the Roman amphitheater, and from here it doesn't look quite so impressive, but as soon as you get closer, it's definitely the best preserved one I've seen. Compared to Silchester or Chichester, it's very complete, well structured. You can see, obviously there would have been banks of wooden seats on these, but it was quite a substantial amphitheatre. And remember, this isn't for a town, this is for the legionaries. So the legionaries needed to have entertainment, and they had an amphitheatre for sport and fighting, and probably not gladiators and fights to the death like you see in a Hollywood movie, but for general entertainment. This was the cinema multiplex of its day. And still very much part of a living town. The town's developed here, and it's quite difficult to avoid the school kids trying to hide in here before the guard comes and locks up, because it's still right next to a living town, or really a village. Here you can see rooms on the side of the amphitheatre, and you also get a feeling for the depth and scale of it. Remember, this is 2,000 years old, and the Romans didn't do anything by halves, as I've said before. Everything was engineered and built to be strong. You can still see some of the dressing stone on the outside. You can see the cemented infill on the earth banks. But really quite a substantial, probably, I was told 20,000 spectators could attend here. That feels a little bit big. Maybe they were small, but it's a quite decent sized amphitheatre in very good condition considering the years. And still really, until about 6 in the evening, when the guard comes and shouts at everyone to leave and locks up, in public use. It's mainly people walking their dogs today. But very interesting to see such a complete amphitheatre. And you can see there the gate where there's steps up, and still the steps are in place. There's been a degree of reconstruction, but largely it gives you the feel of this, with thousands of people baying for blood or betting and shouting. You get the real atmosphere of the place, and why it was so entertaining for the legionaries to come here. Although, as I say, probably no fights to the death, but certainly a decent provincial amphitheatre. Really enjoyable to see. when you climb up to top, it's even more impressive because you can see the actual structure of the building and you get an idea of just how impressive it must have been in its day. You have to remember there's no entertainment location like this from the ancient Britons. I'm sure they had them, but it's substantial for a minor addendum to a fort, but essential to keep troops happy. Just across from the road and actually open all the time is the barracks. And here you see rows of barracks. There's an earth embankment around the barracks. And there's some brick structures here, these horseshoe-shaped ones. And there's a gate. And you enter through the gate or over this earthenware mound. You always have to remember an earthenware embankment that's 2,000 years old was probably 3 times bigger than it is today. And these are just the foundations. Each one of those would be a room, and as we saw in the Museum of the Legionary, they would have had bunk beds, so probably 2 people to a room, maybe 4. Gives you a feel for how many soldiers there were here and how tight the conditions were. There would have been space for their uniform and a few personal possessions, but nothing too lavish. So that's the gate. You'd enter in through there. And there has been a certain degree of reconstruction. You can tell if you start looking for the doors. When I walked around here at first, I thought, okay, so each one's a room. So where's the corridor between them? How do you get between these rooms? And there are a few where you can see a lowered step to walk through. But there's quite a few where if you take that as the actual wall, there is no getting into the room, and the Romans didn't build rooms you couldn't go into. So there has been a certain level of it. But you can still see beautifully dressed, very straight, very correctly built. There's a grid network in a series of buildings. There's 3 or 4 buildings in a row of different sizes. And you get a real feel for how busy it must have been. There must have been a few hundred soldiers here, a legionary base of maybe 600. And they would have all lived in this quite small area in these 3 rows of barracks, apart from probably the senior officers who would have had a more cushy location, which is now lost to time. But here, this is one of the rooms. So Roman legionaries would have lived in these rooms. One at the end's probably a kitchen or eating area. And today it's open all the time. It's clearly visited. I would say a lot of the people visiting looked like they were walking their dog rather than looking at Roman ruins. But really interesting to see. If you saw my video a few weeks ago where we went to Silchester near Reading, there's a similar embankment. There's a much more substantial wall, a bit more like Caerwent, that you'll see if you watch Monday's video of the local Roman town. But it's a small site. I thought it was quite a substantial fort for this area. But after 2,000 years, you still have an idea of what was going on here. You can see it in your mind's eye. And quite an extensive series of buildings. Must have been quite scary to the local British. 20 years of fighting the Romans, they finally won. And they built this great big fort and a trading post. They didn't adopt the local hill fort as their town the way they did in Silchester. The people around Silchester were much more friendly to the Roman occupation. The Silures wanted their independence, so they got a fortified town near their hill fort. The last stop on this tour of Caerleon is the Roman baths, which have been beautifully protected by this cover, this new roof, and it was renovated during COVID. right next to a car park. There is a charge to get in, but it's free for English Heritage or Cadw members. And here you have a whole cross-section of the baths. Fighting as a soldier is a sweaty job, and you need to keep them clean, entertained and motivated. So they had here a plunge pool. This was actually outside, and now you've just got the foundations. But imagine a swimming pool built 100 years ago, how much of it would remain today? Well, this 2,000-year-old outdoor swimming pool is still very complete. And there would have been, this was the heart of the fortress, as they point out, an outdoor plunge pool with water fed from the river. And then next to that, just round the corner, the building's sort of an L shape, is the frigidarium, the cold water, the heated water, and the very hot steam room. So a sort of outdoor plunge pool, sauna, steam room, and you'd be able to clean yourself very thoroughly. Now the rest of it, that's the plunge pool. You can see there is what we've just been looking at. And of the whole structure, probably about 10% still remains, and it's still quite impressive. If you look around here, looks like being a legionary maybe wasn't such a bad thing after all. Wasn't all fighting. There was time to relax and swim and take a soak and clean yourself. A lot of items around the wall to look at, sort of gives you a potted history of it. There's a model and a reconstruction, so you can see just how substantial this fort's swimming baths was, because really this is swimming baths and sauna. And this is the only bit you have to pay for, and it's really not much, a few pounds. Very much worth a visit. As we turn into the indoor portion, there you can see the hypercoursed tiles, the pillars on the floor that would have been underneath the floor, so that the heating system could put heat into the room. And I really should have put the camera down at this point. I did actually fix the way the camera works after this, so it pivots a lot better in videos from the rest of the trip to Wales. Here you can see nicely colour coded. This is the hot room where you would steam and sweat, cover yourself in olive oil, rub it into your skin to get all that dirt, and you've had hopefully a plunge pool dip outside. And then there would have been a wall where that curtain is. And you'd work your way down through the different rooms. So from the hot room to the very cold room, right next door, freezing cold, and you dip in water in these sunken pools. And I'm sure you'd want to get out as quickly as possible from the frigidarium. And here you have different pieces of covers and stones, and there's even a drain that they've found a lot of jewellery in. Because you should be asking yourself at this point, why isn't it underwater? Where's the water? Well, the river is a couple of 100 metres away. So the reason there's no water in here is on the wall at the back. There was a lead pipe, and the lead pipe carried the water from the river, because rather than building this next to the river where it's liable to flooding and subsidence and it's probably a bit damp and mucky, they wanted this at the centre. So the Romans just piped the water through to where they wanted it. The thing I found with Caerwent and Caerleon is the Romans just didn't do anything half-cocked. They went full on. and they engineered it. So hopefully you've enjoyed our visit to Caerleon with the Museum of the Legionaries, the amphitheater, the barracks, and the beautiful Roman baths. And if you joined us last Saturday, you'd see the unbound history of Caerwent, which was the local trading post, and a lot of pretty complete outdoor buildings, or at least foundations of them, along with a substantial defensive wall. If you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe. We'll be visiting a lot of sites around Wales and quite a few Roman sites in the coming weeks. So hopefully you'll enjoy our Unbound Histories on Saturday and our museum tours on Mondays.